A human revolution has just taken place, and the results have not been as anyone could have ever imagined. Every faction that has tried to control the outcome has lost, and the world is trying to pick itself up and deal with the fallout from an international crisis involving the nature of mechanical augmentations. But what happens as the years progress is an even more extraordinary tale, in which the world as we know it will change, as a secret civil war erupts within the one organisation with the dominion of the world in its eyes. This is the tale of the rise of Majestic 12 and the fall of the Illuminati, or if you will, the Invisible Hand. The year is 2027. The world is still reeling from the dramatic events that took place at the Panchaea facility earlier in the year. During this time, the issue of what should happen to the use and development of mechanical augmentations was put into question, and there were many factions, all offering different answers. However, it must be noted that the mass development and use of mechanical augmentations that was all the craze before the Panchaea Incident was far less widespread now, and in fact there were only a few companies that were willing to carry on the tradition. Though the use of augmentations was not necessarily frowned upon by society, it was in fact a touchy issue that many people decided that they did not want to become involved in. Various companies, such as Sarif Industries and Tai Young Medical, would eventually become either abandoned or dissolved, and the production of this technology was almost entirely dropped by manufacturers. But in the wake of this reversal of fortune for the augmentation technology, there were some that took the opposite approach. In fact, the development of augmentations was about to be taken to the next level, but unlike the development and evolution of mechanical augmentations, which was very much out in the open and widely talked about in the previous decades, this next step in controlled evolution would be carried out in secret by a secret organisation. The Illuminati. Surprisingly enough, this secret society had managed to just slip under the radar during the Panchaea Incident, and no one would ever know about their involvement in it. This allowed the Illuminati to continue in their grand plans for the world. Indeed, the Panchaea Incident did not have a major impact on them, except for the fact that the hard-worked-on Hiram project was now in ashes, and that their ultimate goal for complete control had been set back by several decades. But this certainly did not deter them from their goals. Almost immediately after the Panchaea Incident, plans were put into place by some of the highest-ranking officials of the Illuminati. Among them were Morgan Everett, Dr. Megan Reed, now working with the Society, and Bob Page, the up-and-coming star within the organisation and the head of Page Industries. Their plans were to create several new tools of control that they could wield with undisputed authority. The main two to mention would be the evolution of the augmentation technology. Despite what some would believe, two new types of human augmentation would be born out of Illuminatarian design rather than one. The first would be known as physiopharmaceutical augmentation. With the political situation in Europe and Asia growing much more in the Illuminati's favour, it became necessary for the Society to develop their own brand of super loyal elite agents that would take any order thrown at them without question. The result of this augmentation is quite distinct, and it is easy to spot one of these agents from a mile away. Becoming known as Men in Black, or MIB for short, these agents appear with pale skin, piercing red eyes, black hair, and a robotic-like voice. But if that wasn't enough, the Illuminati felt it necessary to sign each agent with their own logo, and so each agent would have the symbol of the Illuminati tattooed onto the back of their neck. Though not the most effective of augmentations, and only acting as a cheap and quick method of augmenting recruits, the Men in Black would become a notorious symbol of Illuminatarian, and later would represent Majestic 12, rule and authority, being widespread in Europe, but would become mainly based in America in the following decades. The second augmentation would become the superior of the two. In fact, this type of augmentation was already being used and experimented with even before the Panchaea Incident, Working in secret, the Illuminati first saw successful results with Project Araniola, also known as the D Project, in 2023 on a 5-year-old boy called Paul Denton. This new type of augmentation, based on the use of injected microscopic modules called nanites that can improve the human body's performance and provide new abilities, would become known as nano-augmentation technology. With this new success, Majestic 12 scientists, due to this being under MJ12 jurisdiction as it comes under technology and communications, decided that they wanted to replicate these results. By persuading Paul's mother to have another child, though being a clone of Paul, another Denton was born whose DNA was also a compatible match, the newborn boy being called only by his codename, JC. Over the next few decades, these two boys would be crafted into tools of the Illuminati by those in Majestic 12, though of course, the boys themselves were unaware of this. As they grew older, both were eventually infused with the new augmentation technology, of which both were receptive to, much to the delight of MJ12, and both would eventually go on to join UNATCO. However, the world itself was starting to change, thanks to the current political and economic situation worldwide, all of which being influenced by the Illuminati and its subsequent groups. Before continuing, it must be remembered that the Illuminati operates by controlling several groups, each of which would oversee one or two certain areas of civilized life. For example, as stated in the prologue video, the issue of money and finance was overseen by the Bilderberg Group, whilst technology and communications was overseen by Majestic 12. The Knights Templar was another of these groups. Being based in Paris, this ancient organisation had survived the events of the Crusades centuries beforehand, and even the purge led by the French king Philip IV. Although the organisation was hit worse in France, many other chapters in other countries managed to escape the same fate. Particularly in England and Spain, the chapters were granted absolution due to the ridiculous charges brought before them from the French king, and indeed some chapters would go on to form other organisations, such as the Order of Christ, established in Portugal in 1319, which greatly contributed towards Portugal's golden age of discovery, an organisation that still exists today. But as for the knights in France that escaped persecution, they would be driven underground, along with all of their money, which was arguably what King Philip IV was after all along. Here they would remain until being picked up and taken over by the Illuminati. By the 2030s, this organisation was now under the leadership of Stanton Dowd, who would provide the Illuminati and its subsequent organisations with sufficient funds. The Illuminati itself has been weaving its own web of lies as it offers support to different factions worldwide throughout their history. During the Cold War, the Illuminati had provided financial aid to both Communist China and the Soviet Union. It is even possible that the Duclairs may have openly supported the Third Reich in the years before and during the Second World War. All of this would allow the Illuminati to shape the world as they saw fit, as to manipulate global conditions in order to seize power. But this does not mean that everything would work in the Illuminati's favour. Between the years of 2027 and 2052, the world would change dramatically. Although we're not sure of when exactly it happened, the leading figure of the Illuminati would shift from Lucius de Beers to another. Morgan Everett, sensing an opportunity to take action because of de Beers' deteriorating state as a result of old age, decided to step in and remove him from power by having him placed in a cryopod and preserved. Though still alive, de Beers would cease to function as the leader of the Illuminati and would instead become, in the words of Morgan Everett, a human popsicle. A dishonourable move on Everett's part, but from the Illuminati's perspective, any form of weakness within the organisation would not be tolerated, including old age. Then there were issues involving the wider world. First off, the issue of controlling public opinion and the level of communications that the world was available to access was starting to slip through the Illuminati's fingers. The Global Information Network allowed users freedom of information, and although this was something to be happy about for the people of the world, this was, however, something of the opposite nature for the secret society that was all about control. Unfortunately for the Illuminati, this issue is one that would not be solved so easily. Several attempts were made at solving this issue, but none came close. The most successful solution to this problem was the introduction of the Echelon Protocol. The Echelon Protocol was a method in which the Illuminati could spy on what people were saying over the net, and could, in some way, influence public opinion. The most famous case for this so far was the use of Eliza Cassan of Picus TV, who would pass information to the Illuminati, and as the face of the world news, she was able to influence public opinion to some extent. And although Eliza was never actually described as being part of the Echelon Protocol, her purpose and function does seem to fit the bill perfectly. Several other versions would later be produced after Eliza was scrapped, but none of them would ever make the mark. Echelon 4 Mark I, known as Morpheus, would be created successfully from leftover technology from the Hyron project, but would not be used by the Illuminati at all, ending up as an entertainment system for Morgan Everett's house guests, whilst the Mark II unit, known as Daedalus, would become a thorn in Majestic 12's side in the coming years. But with this issue going unresolved, an evidential weakness on the Illuminati's behalf was starting to appear. This would eventually be driven home by one botched attempt for control. Several new diseases and infections would flow worldwide, killing off thousands of people and severely crippling the middle class, of which the Illuminati was dependent on. Also, despite the Illuminati gaining significant influences in both Europe and Asia, it did not, however, have much of a say in the United States. This was something of which they had tried to solve on one occasion by taking advantage of the devastation seen on the American West Coast in the 2030s due to several severe earthquakes occurring in that area, and by the fact that this area had already been hit hard by many diseases. This opportunity, however, was later lost on them. Hoping that the US government would collapse as a result of this situation, and by the growing number of freelance terrorist groups that were on the rise in the States around this time, the Illuminati decided to take an approach that would eventually destroy any hope they had for global domination. The society decided to do nothing. This course of action resulted in many members of the society becoming enraged by this complete disregard for the Illuminati's goals, and many members decided to break off from the group. In truth, many Illuminati members had wanted to do this for several years. However, they had only been waiting for an excuse to do it, in order to have a justified reason, rather than saying that they had simply wanted to go their own way. Many members of this society would transfer over to another of the sub-societies of the Illuminati, one that was seeing greater success and with a leader that had the drive and foresight to lead them into the new world. Acting as the head of Majestic 12, Bob Page and his supporters declared their independence from the Illuminati, taking with them everything that was once owned by the Illuminati, as well as the Illuminati's pride. Now being the de facto ruler of most of the world, Page put in motion an effective, yet devastating plan for ultimate power. First and foremost, Page decided to shut down several organisations that were no longer required. The Knights Templar was one of these groups. By hiring someone who Page had already worked with in the past, a government agent called Joseph Mandely stormed into Paris with forces from Interpol and another organisation that he was currently heading, of which we'll get to soon, and subsequently destroyed the Templars, confiscating their money and emptying their banks. The Templar leader, Stanton Dowd, manages to escape the incident, though only just. With that organisation gone, Page begins to focus more on what Majestic 12 was originally set up for, that being the research and development for the means to control technology and communications. As already stated, the two augmentation projects were put into effect. However, another nanite-based project, aside from the nano-augmentation project, was also under development, though this project was not aimed at improving the human body, but rather destroying it. A new virus was being worked on by Majestic 12 scientists that would be so devastating that it would become aptly known as the Grey Death. The Grey Death would become one of humanity's greatest threats and would become feared worldwide. Although being devised in the late 2020s by key Illuminati members, including Dr. Megan Reed, of whose work the virus is based upon, it was never originally intended that the virus should be used as a weapon. Bob Page was the only one to voice the idea of weaponizing it, but this idea was rejected outright by the rest of the society. Now with Page in total control, this idea was resurrected. Being produced by the biological research firm VersaLife, a vassal company of Page Industries, along with its only known vaccine Ambrosia, this virus would target many different people, mainly those who were considered a threat to Majestic 12's plans, or whose contraction of the virus would benefit the organisation. This put Page and MJ12 in a very strong position. Being that they were the only people that had access to Ambrosia, they could bully, threaten and control anyone, usually those of political influence, to do what they wanted. An example of this can be found during the introduction to the first Deus Ex game, as Page informs Walton Simons that one of the US senators was infected with the virus in order to secure Simons' position as head of FEMA. But one of the biggest breakthroughs that Majestic 12 saw was the resolution of the communications problem that had plagued the Illuminati for several decades. It was the Illuminati's inability to control the public's access of information that would contribute to their downfall, and Majestic 12 was not about to make the same mistake. Being developed by Page Industries, Bob Page has succeeded in creating an information protocol that allowed two things. Firstly, the general public were able to access information more freely and readily, and secondly, everything that took place on the net was being directly monitored by Majestic 12. This protocol was seen to be the next step in the development of the Echelon system, and was later named Aquinas, after the philosopher Thomas Aquinas, a historical figure who Page had studied often in the past. Though originally developed for the Illuminati, Page had held back on Aquinas' release, feeling that the Illuminati's downfall was at hand, and once this had come to pass, Aquinas was released, strengthening Majestic 12's position. However, there would be other ways in which Majestic 12 would attempt to secure control within the United States. So far we have only covered the technological methods, but it is also important to consider the political methods as well. Several new agencies and organisations would be created and taken over in the coming decades, all aimed at placing Majestic 12 in power of the world. Now focused solely on America, Page assessed the state's political climate. After the Panchaea Incident, the Illuminati had come to the conclusion that there were far too many independent terrorist groups around the world. Evidence of this already been shown by the actions taken by Purity First, the Halfster gangs and triads such as the Red Arrow, and cartels, the likes of which had previously kidnapped David Sarif's niece. The solution to this was to establish a world police force that was tasked solely with responding to and eliminating global terrorist threats, a job that the former company Bell Tower was good at. Although posing as a UN organisation, the now established United Nations Anti-Terrorist Coalition, or UNATCO for short, was originally just another arm of the Illuminati, though coming under MJ12 control after their takeover. Although it's not clear when this organisation was established, it is clear that it must have come about shortly after the Panchaea Incident, with several key figures becoming members, such as Gunther Hermann, a former member of the Tyrants, Paul Denton, the first nano-augmented agent, weapons specialists such as Sam Carter, and all of it headed up by Joseph Mandely. Initially being based outside of the US, UNATCO would eventually settle their headquarters on Liberty Island in New York City, after the Statue of Liberty was destroyed, being falsely blamed on the French terrorist faction called Silhouette, though this itself was a cover-up. It was also UNATCO, along with Interpol, that would lead the attack on the Knights Templar in Paris, all on the orders of Bob Page of course. However, despite UNATCO's political flexibility in being able to operate in any country worldwide under UN law, it was subject to another organisation. FEMA. The Federal Emergency Mobilization Administration was first established in 1978, though had existed in some form dating back to the early 19th century. During its lifetime, it had served different purposes, but by the late 2020s, it had seen a dramatic revamp, becoming renamed as the Federal Emergency Management Agency. This new version of the organisation's jurisdiction was to respond to natural disasters and major domestic issues within the United States. In short, This was another response to the Illuminati's American problem. But as Majestic 12 began their hostile takeover of all of the Illuminati's grounds, FEMA was also caught up in this. Now under the command of MJ12, FEMA was able to gain grounds and authority over other aspects of the Majestic 12 empire. Because UNATCO was focused on dealing with international terrorism, it was easy for FEMA to take direct control of the organisation due to the fact that US terrorism counts as a domestic issue, of which FEMA has authority to deal with. Thus, when Bob Page assigns Walton Simons as the head of FEMA, Simons becomes the de facto head of UNATCO as well, using Manderley as a puppet. But as MJ12 terror is put into effect, some independent terrorist groups begin to take more drastic actions and begin to present a real threat to the progress towards the New World Order. Silhouette was one such faction. Already mentioned, Silhouette was a resistance movement against the current French government, set up presumably during the 2030s and 40s. Though France, and in particular Paris, is no stranger to uprisings, rebellions and resistance movements, what set Silhouette apart from most resistance groups was both their method in putting their point across, and who exactly they were fighting. Though it's possible to compare the MJ12 rule in France with the Nazi occupation and the Vichy government, as both MJ12 and the Nazis were international organisations, and both after world domination, arguably the case with the Nazis, the depth of control Majestic 12 had over modern day society ran far deeper than Hitler could have ever hoped to achieve. Almost all aspects of society had either been infiltrated or completely taken over by Majestic 12 by the 2050s, and thus this made Silhouette's stand against the regime much more noticeable. Their methods of sabotage are also noteworthy. Although relying mainly on devastating hit-and-run tactics, Silhouette are also known for their propaganda, which they display openly. In one case, they had an advert broadcast during the 2050 World Cup in which they downplayed the use of mechanical augmentations. Being made up of French intellectuals, it is easy for Silhouette to come up with this type of propaganda, though the use of lethal force is also a tactic that they are forced to employ on certain occasions. Silhouette are not alone in this struggle, and have actually indirectly found unlikely friends. In particular, Silhouette have managed to gain financial support from the one organisation that they would be at war with had Majestic 12 not taken over, and that is the Illuminati. Since the secret society had fallen after MJ12's takeover, they have been run into the ground, and now are using any and all means to claw their way back up, and this includes supporting Silhouette with money. In fact, the figurehead of Silhouette, Chad Dumier, is romantically linked with the daughter of one of the key members of the Illuminati, Beth DeClaire, former head of the World Health Organization, the daughter in question being Nicolette, who would in turn provide Illuminati funding to the resistance movement, possibly without the Illuminati's knowledge. But Silhouette had other allies despite the Illuminati, allies that were more down to their level. The terrorist group that would rise above all else in the US was the National Secessionist Force, or NSF for short. This group was formed initially in 2027 as the New Sons of Freedom under the CEO of Lebedev Global Exports, Juan Lebedev, but would rename during the earthquakes seen on the American West Coast. When states such as California were left to fend for themselves after these disasters and the spread of disease, the NSF reformed and began calling for certain states to break away from the United States, and many states were ready to listen to them. Though this separatist attempt failed, the NSF was still respected by a large percentage of US citizens in the American West, and as new anti-gun laws were introduced to the nation, eliminating the US Second Amendment, the NSF were the first ones to take a stand against this decision, gaining a lot more respect from US citizens who saw the NSF as defenders of the true American nation. This support would begin to grow once again over the next few years, until the NSF had broken out of their western confines and were now operating in places such as New York City. It was to this effect that the US federal government declared the NSF as terrorists, and shortly after, the United Nations declared war on them as well. Other supporting organisations include the Luminous Path. Based in Hong Kong, China, the Luminous Path were one of the warring triads of the underground culture. Not being a friend of Majestic 12, it was easy for this group to ally themselves with other terrorist factions around the world. However, the Luminous Path was not as active in respect of any anti-MJ12 actions compared with other organisations. The reason for this, and not surprisingly, comes down to the nature of the triads. During the 2040s and early 2050s, the Luminous Path was in the middle of a dispute with their rival gang, the Red Arrow. Though the relationship between these two triads was poor at best, there were almost no cases of hostility between them, each clan in a state much similar to that of the superpowers during the Cold War. Each side knew that they'd go to war soon, but neither side wished to start it. This upcoming war was later brought forward thanks to the endeavours of Maggie Chow, but we'll get to that in the next video. Needless to say that the Luminous Path was ready and willing to provide assistance in the world anti-MJ12 movement, but until the issues faced with the Red Arrow were concluded, they could simply not afford to lend a hand. Finally, the last supporters of the anti-MJ12 movement are a group of scientists known as X-51. Though more of an independent group compared with the rest of the supporters, this group of scientists and researchers originally worked for Majestic 12. But as Bob Page began to put his sinister plan into motion, some of those who worked for MJ12 did not appreciate or approve of this new direction. By 2051, many Area 51 scientists had had enough and decided to walk out and quit their jobs. But before leaving, they upped and stole anything they could carry that was of value to Majestic 12, including the next Denton prototype, a 5-year-old boy called Alex, and destroyed parts of the Area 51's Universal Constructor, the machine capable of creating the Grey Death virus and its cure Ambrosia. The group would eventually settle in the abandoned Vandenberg Air Force Base, where they would begin to work on a possible cure for the Grey Death, and all of this was headed up by the scientist Gary Savage, a man who had contributed vital work on the Hiram project at the Rifleman Bank Station several decades earlier, among other blacklisted experiments for the US government and MJ12. Now the year is 2052, and the world stands under the grip of universal fear. People worldwide are dying by the thousands, and a global economic recession has just reached the height of its wrath. Terrorist splinter cells are on the rise, and people are losing hope as the world crashes and burns all around them. It would appear that the vision that Janus, the Juggernaut collective hacker, had shown Special Agent Kelso all those years ago was rapidly becoming a reality. And, at a time like this, one man begins his new job at Unatco, a man who is about to reshape the world. But that is a story for another time. Join us next time, as one man's first day at work will throw him headlong into a global conspiracy where the fate of the world will be held in the balance. As all others are killed or crushed by the Majestic 12 onslaught, this one man will attempt to restore freedom to modern society once more. A man who can only be described as being sent from God, or in the Latin if you will, Deus Ex. All of this next time in episode 4, From God.